Yeah, we do. I've got an agenda in here in a slide or two that shows the whole week, and then one that will show the a little bit more detailed look at what we're going to do today, which I'll sort of repeat the overall agenda every week, and then have the specific agenda for the day in the beginning. And I think Alan had emailed out what I thought was the agenda at the time, and I haven't really veered too much out of that. I might have reordered a few things and added a little more detail, but that's about it. Um, and so with that, I guess my name is Drew Reichenbach. I have been with mechanical simulation for almost I guess it was four years in March, going on 5. And But I am a mechanical engineer by education, bachelor's and master's from Michigan State University, and an MBA from the University of Michigan. And just a little bit conflicted, about that, but it's all good, except for football game season. That's rough. Um, I've been in the automotive industry doing simulation related work for a long time. I was at Ford for 5 years doing fuel economy, performance, fuel, and shift quality simulation work using an in-house code that they have. And after that, I spent some time at AVL doing powertrain simulation work with their code AVL Cruise. It's a 0D tool. And then for the last few years, it's been back to my favorite topic of vehicle dynamics here with mechanical simulation. And the sort of work that I did at AVL was very similar to what I do here, which is training and quality assurance on the software, technical support, writing documentation. Really, we wear many hats. And so, but training is one of my favorite parts of my job. And so I'm glad that I get to be here with everyone today. And with that, I'm going to start moving in. I used to be able to say I only have 4 slides, and mostly I work in the tool, but because this is a web forum, instead of all of us sitting in the same room, I added a few slides. But the idea I had was that I could send these slides to Alan as a PDF, and you guys could have a copy after the meeting.
Hi, Drew. Are you
Yeah.
sharing any slides in there? I'm not able to see your screen.
Yes, I forgot to push that button. All right. I pushed all the other buttons. Let's see here. Screen sharing. Screen, whole screen. Yes, entire screen. Share. Yeah, entire screen. Share. Let's see. Is that working now?
Yep. Yeah, I think I can see it.
All right. You can see my slide, Vehicle Slim for new users.
Yep. Yeah, we are able to see now, Drew.
Yay!
Thank you.
All right. I was only looking at this slide while I was talking, so it works out. And this is just, interestingly enough, this is actually a screenshot from our animator that we took on one of the roads. One of my coworkers found a really good camera angle, and so we took it and we added in a lot of trees and things to make it look pretty, and took a screenshot. And I've liked it so much that I have stuck it as the first image in the training slides. So, all right. So here is the overall agenda that I was talking about. We've got the introduction that we're going to talk about the parts of the software, sort of navigating the user interface, documentation, help, where to find them, how to use them, things like that, and running some basic examples, right, just to kind of get started. So it will be hands-on. There'll be kind of some switching on my part back and forth between PowerPoint and the CarSim user interface to show everybody how to do that stuff. We've also got some discussions on the vehicle model, where it comes from, parameterizing it, configurable functions, kind of an overview of everything in there. If we were to to go in detail into the vehicle model, we would probably spend about 100 weeks because there's a lot of different choices, and it really all boils down to we have to be able to simulate the types and sizes and design of all of the vehicles currently on the market, plus things that people are still inventing. And so that means that the model is pretty extensive, especially now that we're moving into the ADAS and autonomous vehicle kind of environment. We'll spend some time talking about the procedure and the environment, the road and the properties of the road, paths, the driver controls, plotting, things like that. And then as we get to it, we'll start talking about advanced topics. And these are things that will be, I think, particularly interesting in terms of the work that you guys are doing and putting the training together. So some other types of road definitions, something we call events, which is sort of if-then simulation control, interfacing with other software like Simulink or LabVIEW or Python, and model extension. Python sort of falls more in the model extension because it operates a little differently. It's embedded right within the solver. Whereas Simulink or LabVIEW, things like that, would use our co-simulation interface. And the nice thing about the interface is that it's really pretty consistent. Whether you're using Simulink or LabVIEW or real-time tools, the interface, at least from the CarSim side, is going to be the same. And so if you have a model set up to run in a mill environment, say with Simulink, and then you want to move it over to actually run with the hardware in a hill environment, the I/O on the CarSim side could actually be exactly the same and reused. And so that's pretty useful. So that's kind of the overview. And so I expect to get probably through the introduction portion today. And so today's agenda, right, is going to be focusing on the introduction. We'll talk about the parts of the software, get some basic terminology, some jargon down, so that when I say database and you guys hear database, we're all thinking about the same thing, at least as far as CarSim goes. We're going to do some navigating around in the UI because it works. This can be one of the parts where there's the steepest learning curve, just in terms of making sure that the input you put in gives you the simulation that you're looking for. We'll talk about the documentation and help and things like that, and we're going to run some basic examples. And I've got two of them. I've got one that I call an example, which is putting some new tires onto a hatchback. And this example is sort of, we'll work through it together. And then I've got what I call a task, and it'll be modifying the center of gravity on a utility truck. And that one I have more designed as I give you some sort of basic instructions, and then I turn you loose to work on it for a little bit. And then we walk through it afterwards to try and see, like, because it's sort of one thing, right, when we're all talking and going through it together, and it's another thing entirely to have to sort of synthesize the information to do something a little new. But I've found that it really, at least the feedback I've gotten, is that having the task where I'm not sort of going through it right as you guys are doing it really help people sort of solidify some of the concepts. So that is what I'm doing. I thought, so we have a 3-hour session, so I set a couple of timers just so that I could give us a break at an hour and maybe 2 hours, just so that we could have a few minutes to stretch our legs and get a drink of water or coffee or whatever you need this morning. So as Alan mentioned, there is the chat as well. If you have a question and you don't want to speak up, but you don't want to forget it, so we can address it towards the end, go ahead and type that into the chat panel, and Alan and I will check on that when we can. All right, so let's really dive in then. Start out with, what is CarSim? So CarSim is a tool for simulating vehicle dynamics, so really the vehicle response to various inputs. There are three main parts. There's the VS browser and the database, and that's sort of the user interface and how you can parameterize your vehicle model. There's the VS solver program, which actually takes the parameters and runs the simulation. There's the VS visualizer, and that is for animation and plots. And you can do animation, plots, and plots together, which actually turns out to be really very useful when looking at the vehicle response to what you're doing, because you can see both sort of the state of the car visually, which conveys a lot of information, as well as what's going on in the output plots. And you can see how they're kind of connected here. Is that the browser has some camera information and animation information, which it passes to the visualizer, and the model information to the solver, which when you execute it gives you simulation results, which also go to feed the output. So the three main parts really are the browser, the solver, and the visualizer. So we'll start talking some useful terminology. So to start, I call it the VS browser. VS stands for Vehicle Sim, and it sort of is the umbrella for CarSim, Truck Sim, Bike Sim, Suspension Sim. Anything that sort of works commonly across the tools tends to get the prefix VS for Vehicle Sim. So the browser is the name for the user interface, and as you'll see, it has a lot of the feel of a web browser. There is the solver, the VS solver, right? And this is the one, it uses numerical methods to solve the dynamics equations, right? And it's one of the most important parts about working with CarSim or any vehicle dynamics simulation tool, is to remember that we're not actually driving a vehicle. We are driving some equations, and the inputs are going to be discrete instants in time. And so where the real road might be smooth or might have bumps in a certain pattern, because we are sampling, although we're sampling at a very high frequency, 2000 hertz, we are still sampling. And so we can only really respond to dynamics right within that frequency. And you can always decrease the time step, which of course increases the simulation time. But we've found generally that the default time step works for most systems. It is possible to make it stiff enough that you'd want to decrease the time system or the time step, but that's not very common. And we've got something called the database, or the working directory. And this is really a folder in the Windows file system, and it contains a bunch of subfolders. And inside there, you'll find all of the data needed to run CarSim simulations. The individual files that you'll find in the database are called parse files. It stands for parameters file. And this was sort of like before CarSim had a UI. This was how you used it. That's way back in the days when it was still at Umtree. But it's a text file. It's human readable if you know the keywords that are sent to the solver. The parse files are all identified with something called a UUID. It's not a method that we invented, we just implemented it, but the idea is that all of the unique data sets have unique identifiers, which means that you can put your database into version control. So if you're working on something with a team, you can check in information, and changes to particular data sets can get recognized by the version control system. In the office, we use Subversion, but I've also heard of companies using Git and other things like that to keep track of changes to their CarSim database. I'll also use the word data set, and a data set and a parse file really go hand in hand. They're like two sides of the same piece of paper. And the data set, I say, is the GUI representation. So it's the representation of the input information in the UI. You don't have to remember all of the keywords. and there's a lot more information and help and things like that. So you can enter the information that way and see it reflected in the parse files. We have something, I'll say category a lot, category and data set. Category is just a group of data sets. There's nothing really unique about it. It just allows an extra layer of organization in the datasets menu. So handling simulations can be grouped together, or vehicle information about a C-class hatchback can be grouped together, things like that. Makes it easier for us humans to find our way around in the database. Okay, a little bit more. I'll say library an awful lot as well. And so the way the UI is organized is into libraries. And libraries will be for groups of data sets that focus on the same set of model input data. For example, you may have, say, a rear suspension kinematics data set for a C-class hatchback and also for a B-class hatchback, or a sports car, or a heavy truck, or things like that, a pickup truck. Those would all be individual data sets that exist in the rear suspension kinematics library. So it's a way to group them together. Sometimes we call them screens, or in the documentation we might call them screens, because each library has sort of a unique view in the user interface. And there's something called a dataset link, and these are often called blue links, which when we look in the UI, you'll see when you form the link correctly, the color is blue. It's got two parts. It's got a ring control on the top where you can pick the library, and then the link itself, which is often below that, which serves to help you to connect data in different libraries together. So the library selector, as I said, that's the ring control at the top. There's a little drop-down list, and you can pick then, say, oh, from the top of the simulation, I need to pick a vehicle, so I can do that. And inside my vehicle, I might have library dataset links to brakes and suspension and things like that. The links can be a bunch of colors, and the color of the link identifies kind of what's going on. If it's blue, it's a functional link to another data set. It works, it's a lot like a hyperlink. If it's gray, if the field is gray, it means that the field is currently empty, but you can link to another data set. And clicking the arrow next to one of those will let you pick a new one. If it's red, that means that the data set that was in the link no longer exists for some reason. Usually it means that the data set was deleted, either from the UI or by removing the parse file from the database in the Windows file system. Sometimes, but it's not as common, you'll see a link that is green. Green links are to encrypted parse files. Encrypted data, once the data is encrypted, you cannot unencrypt it. And so the data, you can't view it from within the UI. The contents are not written out into any of the runtime documentation. You cannot encrypt all libraries. And the data set name and the category remain plain text. So if someone says, oh, hey, I named my thing, secret model 1 and put identifiable information in it and then encrypted it, but people still could see it was secret model 1. It's because the title needs to be plain text. And new is an orange color for the links. And so from time to time, we will replace a library with a method that we've discovered or engineered that works better or has more functionality or something like that. And so we're going to remove old libraries. And so we'll color those links orange when we decide that we're going to remove them in a few versions. And you'll get some other notifications as well. But there will also always be some help documentation that says, here is how you go from the library with the orange link to its replacement. So there's always information on how to convert that. That is a lot of new terminology, but it gets us started and hopefully on a common playing field when we start. All right, so this is a slide of it, but I'm also going to flip over. It was just, I do a lot of like pointing and whiteboard, and I found I had to replace that with slides. So this was a good way to annotate so that everyone could see. This is, excuse me, a screenshot of the CarSim user interface called the CarSim browser. I think of it as being broken up into some columns. There's this first column on the left, which is for the vehicle and the test. So it's like, what is the input to the simulation? What are the parameters for the model? What is the procedure and the environment? Is there any extra information I want to include? And then I think of the middle column as, here's where we run the test. If we're linking to some other co-simulation tool, that will be apparent right up here in the center. And then there's, of course, when the simulation is over, if you want to view or analyze or post-process, you can do that, including this lower area here in the lower right, where you can view information about the model that's configured. This is the sort of runtime documentation. That documentation is particularly important, and we'll use it a lot today, because a lot of the content in the vehicle model is modular, meaning if you don't have an ADAS sensor parameterized and installed, then we're not going to do the calculations for the ADAS sensors, and we're not going to write the outputs for the ADAS sensors. And so going into the runtime documentation, we'll say, okay, I think I have the model configured some way. How does the solver understand that it is configured? And one of the nice things too is that some of this runtime documentation can actually be used to run an entire simulation. So it can serve as a way to like pre-run, say, the speed ramp up and settle, and then you can stop the simulation and you can use the end documentation from that simulation as the input conditions for the next one, so that you're only testing the maneuver over and over again. It can save a lot of time, especially in large DOE sessions and things like that. All right, so with that, this is normally where I switch over to the browser. And so if you haven't already, I would like everyone to launch CarSim. I will do that as well. I have many versions of CarSim on this machine. There's no reason you can't have more than one. They all work well together. And when you first launch CarSim, you'll see a window that looks something like this. It says select recent database. And the idea is that you can have more than one CarSim database on a machine. You can have the one that we ship, which I'll often call the installation database. And then you can have an additional database for each project, or for whatever information you want to have that's discrete. A lot of times in my role as technical support, I will actually create a user will send me information about a simulation that's not working properly, and I will create a brand new database from that information, so I can keep it isolated from the installation data so I can see what's really going on. So in this case, I only have one database showing here. That's the working database, which is just what I named a database where I go break all the things all the time. So I'm going to click the Browse for another database button, and I'm going to go to, let's see here, I want that to be in Where did I put it? I'm trying to remember. Oh yeah, I remember now. I put it on the desktop, so that would be C users public documents. There we go. So this is one of the default places. You can get sort of two cases. One is that will be installed if you install just for the local user. It will be in say my folder here. I installed CarSim for all users of this computer, and so it puts the database in the public documents folder. I added another folder level there, but you'll see a folder named CarSim data, and you probably have that one by default in that window. So when I picked the database and clicked OK, it found it and it brought up the license setting windows. And this window, you can, if you've only got one license or you always use the same configuration, you can skip it. There is a box down here in the lower left-hand corner that says don't show this window when starting. And if you check that box, then whatever licenses you have checked out in this list will be the ones you always check out by default. If you check the box and then find later that you want to change the settings, that's fine. You can do that from within the browser. But if you're doing maybe some testing that's driven by automation, you maybe don't want to see this window all the time, and so you can suppress it with this checkbox. So I'm going to keep all of these licenses. This is my local machine license. There's also this column here called key ID. And the key ID is important. That's your license number. And so when you call into tech support or you write into tech support, one of the first questions we're going to ask is, what is your key ID? It helps us make sure that the license is in maintenance, and it helps us make sure, see what features you have, right? So if I see in here that, for example, if I did not have a CarSim trailer license and I was trying to use trailers, then I would say, oh, the problem right here is that, we need to add a trailers license to do what you're trying to do. And you can contact your account manager and they can help you out with that sort of a thing. So, but for purposes of the class, I think the licenses have all the features, and they should certainly have all the features we're going to use today. So we should be okay. I'm just going to press select. All right, there we go. Of course, I was viewing a different data set in here before I copied it. So when it loads, you will probably see this this view right here. I'm going to minimize the slides so it's not so distracting behind it. Here we are. So this is the same view that I had sort of taken a screenshot of. And we've got, like I said there, we've got the test specifications and the center where you can run the simulation, and then the third column where you can see the results. And one of the things we do when we ship CarSim is just before we build the installer, we run all of the examples. And that means that all of the example data, all of the examples, even if you don't have a license for them, you can at least browse and see how the data is configured in the database, and you can view the results, right? So if you were going to use that trailer's license to run a simulation, but you didn't have it yet, you could still see the trailer input data screens, and you could watch how that simulation would perform in the plots and the video. It's just that you couldn't run the math model. With that, my timer has gone off, and this is actually a very good place to take a little break. I'm going to see if I can find the participants window. Where'd you go? All right, let's see here. Are there any questions right now before we take a little break? I don't see anything in chat. And I guess if
I have a question, Drew.
yeah.
Do you want us to create a new database to work with you, or just the quick start baseline as you are going like that is enough?
I think
Selected data.
using so while we work today, I'll be using the installation database, the one that installed when you installed the software.
Okay.
And we'll make a new database in the process, but it will be more for the practice of making a database rather than specifically to run it, because I like to take pieces of vehicles and things that are in the installation data to use for examples. So it's fine to work right in the installation database.
Okay, Drew. Thank you.
Yeah. And I guess one other thing to mention too is if during training today, you end up in a state where your installation database is hopelessly muddled, which I will come right out and say, my first 6 months working with CarSim, I probably muddled my database a lot. Just from being on the phone and working at the same time trying to answer a question and then realizing that I couldn't undo what I just did for one reason or another, you can always run the installer again and just install the data. If you uncheck all of the boxes except for the data, it will just install a new copy of the database for you, and you can start off fresh and clear. Actually, if I show you my folder here, so this is all of the software I have. So I have every version of CarSim from CarSim 8 to CarSim 2020. So it's this whole section right here. And then what I usually do is in the data folder, I have the installation database, which is a clean database. And then I make copies for the things that I'm working on. And every so often, I'll take the working database and rename it archive and copy paste installation database again, just so that I have a fresh copy even now. It's very handy to be able to go back to clean sometimes. So my installation and kind of the way I have it set up is very specific to the way you have to do it when you're supporting all of these different versions. And so for the work you guys are doing, just letting it install into the programs folder and to have the database in the public data folder is really just fine. Or wherever you want to put them, CarSim doesn't care particularly. So with that, I think let's take a break. Like I said, by my cell phone, it is 10:05. So I'm going to mute and go get a glass of water, and I'll be back in about 5 minutes. I think that would be just a good time to make sure. If anybody has questions or they couldn't get CarSim launched, please let us know. Alan and I will be paying attention, and we can try and help get that sorted out as well. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Drew.
Mm-hmm. So, all right. So, that and bring this back up. Okay. So when looking at the user interface, one of the key things is you can check up in the title bar for the window, and it really helps that I can blow this up in on the screen in PowerPoint. You'll see up at the top there's the little CarSim logo, and then there's a bunch of information that is always useful, so you can tell where you're at. It's got the name of the database, so it could say CarSim data. It could say, in my case, it might say installation database, or it might say working database, but it lets me know which database I'm currently in. Tells you which library you're in. So the top level library is the CarSim Run Control library. And then you'll see the category kind of surrounded by curly braces and the title of the data set. So in this case, for this screenshot, it was baseline number 1, which means it's been duplicated once. And so as you go through the user interface, I'll switch back over here and bring up, am I still sharing? I am still sharing, oh good. Bring up CarSim again. Let's see, let's make this, yeah, it's probably about as big as it can be right now. Up here in the title bar, I've got CarSim data, run control. And if I was to pick another data set, here, let's do this one. You can see that, so in the curly braces, it changed so that the category is now ADAS and active safety. And the title of the data set is ACC, or adaptive cruise control, 4-lane road with forward and opposing traffic. There's also this little L after the end, which means that the data set is locked. In this context, locked means read only, right? So you can lock the data sets so that they're read only, and you can unlock them so you can edit them. And depending on what I'm doing, I'll either unlock everything or I'll unlock just the thing I'm working on so that I don't accidentally make a change. I have spent like a day and a half one day trying to debug why something wasn't working, only to find that when I was gone, it was because my cat sat on the keyboard. So those things do happen. But I've learned to keep my data sets locked when I step away at home. All right, so I'm going to click the back button, go back here and go to the next slide so I can blow it up. All right, so the user interface, like I said, it works a lot like sort of a relational database sitting underneath a web browser. And so in that vein, the top button bar here, just below the menu, is full of buttons. And there's a handful of buttons that are for controlling sort of the data set that you're viewing. And I sort of called them view control buttons, although that's not really an official name for them. But you can go forward and back. And like a web browser, right, that will take you back to the data sets you've seen before and then back forward through the string. So it's just a chain of data sets in the order that you've viewed them in the browser for the current session. When you exit CarSim, that history goes away and starts fresh again the next time you come back. The little arrow, like a web browser, the little arrow next to the back and the forward button, if you click it, will drop out a list of all the things you've seen. So if I pull up the browser here, I visited 2 data sets. So I've got, and then I went back. So I've got back and forward. If I click the drop down arrow, I can see that, okay, previously I'd also viewed that data set, or on the forward side, I viewed that ACC data set. If I go forward and click it, right, the forward button will dim because I'm at the sort of the front of the top of the stack. And if I click the drop down arrow near back, this time it's got the 2 data sets in it. So pretty normal UI navigation as it goes. All right. The home button returns you to the run control screen. So wherever in the database you are, if you select like, how did I get where I am? Or even just, okay, I've made my change, I'd like to run the simulation. The home button will take you back to the run control screen. And it's important to note that when you click the home button, it returns you to the run control screen, and you'll be viewing the last data set from the run control library that you had open, right? Which doesn't necessarily mean that it will run the simulation for the data set you were on previously, right? So if I'm in a vehicle, I can change which vehicle I'm looking at, and that doesn't change what's gone on the run control screen. And you'll see kind of why that is as we really start diving into it. There's the previous and next buttons, these arrows here. those buttons will cycle through the data sets in the current library. And the run control library is a busy one because there's many simulations that we ship. So if I click on the datasets menu up at the top, I get this big long list here. These are categories, and you can tell because they've got the little sort of expandable arrow after them. If it's a data set, it won't have that. And so we've got all these categories, and each category may have a bunch of different data sets in it. And there's only a few rules to dataset names, and it's mostly you can name it whatever you want. We try and avoid letting you have duplicate dataset names, so you can't have ABS split mu and ABS split mu in the same category, because then you'd be like, well, which one is which? The browser in those situations will often automatically append a pound or a hashtag one, a pound one or hashtag one, however you want to call it, to the end of the dataset name. And you'll see, as we work through it a little bit today, you'll see some of those pop up. The other thing is that, there's a couple of characters. I know you can, let's see, most characters on the keyboard I think are okay. There's only one or two that you can't use in a dataset name. And of course, I don't remember what they are at the moment because I've gotten so used to just not using them. But if you try and create a dataset name with a character that can't be used, it warns you and says, hey, you're really not allowed to use question mark in the dataset name, because we use that for something else. But then previous and next. So if I look here in my datasets menu, this is my first one. The next one is this CS 2020.0 animated trace lines bounce sign suite. And so if I hit next, that is the data set that's going to show up. And if I hit previous, it will cycle back upwards through the list. And these are in what I call computer alphabetical order, right? So alphabetical order, and star space comes before A, and star space comes before star space. And we use the asterisks to indicate something of importance. So for example, in this case, in the run control library, you'll see a group of categories that have CS 2020 in front of them. These are examples that were new for CarSim 2020. And so when 2020.1 comes out, our next release, these will all be sort of sorted down into these various categories down here, and there'll be a new group up here that will say CS 2020.1 and then have a description or something. We always use 2 stars before the quick start guide example so that it's at the very top. And then there's this category here, more examples with extra license options. These are examples that specifically require, not only possibly an additional license on our side, but a license to run the related software. So you can see here there's a powertrain example that also requires an AVL Cruise license, or a license where one where the powertrain comes from GT Power, right, from Gamma Technologies. There's a bunch in here, MF Swift and MF Tire. These are all tire models, which would require a license from, heavens, they were called Test. Now they're called Siemens, I think. Or this one here from Michelin Tame Tire. And so in order to execute those, you'd need an additional license. But like all the examples, like I said, we run these, so we have licenses for all of them. And so, even if you don't have this F-Tire license, you can still see the video. You can see the buttons are not gray. You can still view the video and look at the plots to see sort of how the simulation ran. All right, so I'm going to click back all the way up. Yep, back to baseline. Okay. There's a sidebar button, and that's this one over here. So this is over on this side right here. And I usually leave the sidebar open If I'm shrinking the sidebar, it's usually because I'm trying to have two things up on my laptop monitor at the same time, a document and or an email message or something, and the CarSim window, or two CarSim windows, I guess, or some embedded controls code, or some controls code or something, and the CarSim window would also be an option. And the sidebar is this area over here. It's got a field up at the top that's got what we call embedded notes, and those are some just some text information that goes with goes with the data set. So when we use it, we usually use it for things like a description of what is special about this simulation, special enough to make us include it in the shipping database. But I've seen, from customers, what they've sent me, a lot of times it will say, I got this data from Bob, here's a link, and this is version 1 of this data set, right? So they'll use it for data source information or other things like that. And so you can write whatever you'd like in there. And I've actually seen a lot of customer data where all of their embedded notes say this is a baseline example used in the CarSim Quick Start Guide, because they've started with this example and just duplicated from there without ever replacing the embedded notes. Excuse me. The other thing that's in the part of the sidebar is this tree view of the simulation. And this is a view, so sort of starting at the run control screen and going all the way down through the current simulation. Every time you see a plus, that is a blue link to another data set. And so we've got animator camera setup listed first. And so that is this link over here. So you can see it's got 13 degrees azimuth, 9 elevation, etc. So it's a sort of descriptive name. If I expand it, I will see that below that is a link to a reference frame, the vehicle XYZ coordinates no yaw. If I was to follow this link, and so blue links work a lot like hyperlinks in that if you click them, you are taken somewhere. In this case, right, so now I'm viewing the camera data set. You can see in the sidebar that the animator data set that I'm currently viewing is now the one that's in bold. And I can see right here, here's the link to the reference frame vehicle XYZ. And so that's there. And if I click into that link, now that's the one that's bold. And so here I've kind of hit the bottom of this particular chain because there's no more blue links. And so I can either use the back button or I can use the home button. Either one would be fine to go back up to the run control screen. So I'm going to press the home button because it's one less button click. All right. Oh, the whole point of that, got a little sidetracked, but the whole point of that is that the sidebar button, if I click it, will make the sidebar go away. And so you can see that whole area disappeared and I'm left kind of with the page. If I click it again, it's a toggle. The sidebar will come back. You can actually adjust the size, so I can make the sidebar a little bigger or smaller as I need to. And if I want to spend more space on embedded notes, I can adjust vertically as well by dragging. There are some buttons at the bottom of the tree view. Expand and collapse will expand all and collapse all of the link data sets. Refresh, if you've changed the linked data sets in places and it doesn't seem like the tree is quite following what you're doing anymore, clicking refresh will start back at the top and recrawl kind of through them and correct any changes in the tree. And reset does that and also collapses it back up into the short form. refresh is also occasionally needed. I find that what refresh does is it will go to the parse file and reread it and then reload the GUI screen with the information from the parse file. And I would say most times, most actions that you take in the GUI will cause a refresh automatically. Sometimes when entering or manipulating table data in configurable functions, which we will get to, the data will be updated, but the plot will not be. And if you want to see the change in the plot, you can just click refresh, and then the plot will redraw. Or if you've zoomed in on the plot or something and you can't see the whole thing, you can hit refresh and it will redraw back at the original size again. So there's more than one way to get there. Okay, so those are sort of view control buttons. Next, we have, I call them sort of database control buttons. These are going to actually do things. So now that I look at this list, I want to work backwards up through it. So I'm going to start at the bottom, lock and unlock. I have those shown as two sort of states, but it's only one button. So if you look up here, there's just the lock button with the unlock picture on it. If I go to the UI, you can see it up there. If I click it, it will unlock. So the picture of the lock changes. So now it's an unlocked data set. The data set is no longer read-only, and I can now make changes. I can type notes in it. On the run control screen in particular, you'll see a message if I relock it there. Some buttons are dimmed because the data set is locked, right? So I can't type new information in the embedded notes. I can't check or uncheck any of the controls. But if I unlock it, I am free to check and uncheck boxes. I can add more notes to the embedded notes over here, or whatever. Let's just do it. More notes. Stay there. I can do all of those sorts of things. And so when you load a database for the first time, everything is locked by default. And as I mentioned earlier, you can either unlock selectively if you're just going to go in and make kind of a surgical edit, or if you're going to be sort of working wholesale in the database and you want to change a lot of stuff or relink things or things like that, then if you go up to the Tools menu and you go, I'd say about 2/3 of the way down, there's a little group here that says lock everything in the database and unlock everything in the database. And I'm going to click unlock everything in the database. It gives you a confirmation window because if you have a lot of data sets, this can take a moment or two. So there we go. And so it says here, right, I finished. Every data set is now unlocked, and that's 4,767 files. Now that is total in the database to run all of the different simulations that are available from that run control screen. An individual simulation certainly uses many less files than that. So click OK. All right, and so now we've got the database unlocked. And now if I was to view, click the link down for the post-processing there, you can see now these fields here are also yellow, right? This data set is also unlocked. Let me go back. So all the data sets in the database are now unlocked. Undo and redo. So now I'm on the second line here, right? So as you make changes to the database, undo and redo will keep track of that. And the two important things to know are undo and redo are specific to the library that you're viewing. Meaning, if I make changes on the run control screen and changes in the vehicle, if I'm looking at the run control screen and I press undo, it's only going to undo the changes to the run control screen. And that is intentional, right? We don't want you accidentally undoing a change on a screen you can't see. And the other thing is that the stack is cleared when you exit the software. So when you close it completely, you'll get a warning that says when you exit the software, you're going to lose your undo information. Are you sure you want to do this? And probably at some point you'll say, of course I'm sure. You'll close it and you'll say, wait a minute, I just wanted to go to a different window. It happens all the time. So if I pull up the browser window here, right, because I've made changes, I added some embedded notes, I changed the status of checkbox a couple of times, I can click undo and it will change, it will alter that, right? So the first undo deletes the embedded notes, and the second one rechecks the checkbox, and the third one unchecks the checkbox. And now I've gone all the way back to the beginning of my changes on this data set. And if I hit redo, it will redo them one at a time. Sort of normal operation. But if I was to instead check and then go to the camera and show ghost trails and go back and then uncheck, and then I hit undo. If I go to the camera, right, ghost trail images is still set, and I can click undo here separately. So it keeps that information, it just, you have to be on the screen in order to undo something for that screen, which is probably about what you would hope for. All right. And then the next two are for getting yourself a new data set and getting rid of an old data set. Okay. All right. Window here. Okay. The duplicate button will take the data set that you are looking at. We'll take the data set that you're looking at and will create a exact copy of it. The only thing that will really be different is that you can change the title information, and you can it will have a new UUID. You can see right here actually in the top of the bar, it says run underscore, and then it's got some numbers, and that's a prefix and then the UUID. And so if I press the duplicate button, I get a little window that says duplicate dataset. It lets me pick a category from the list of available categories, or I could type in a new one. Something like that. And I could give it a new title. And you can see here the default is to keep the same data set name and then append a little #1 to the end. And it's smart, right? So if I duplicate it again, I get baseline #2 and baseline #3 if I keep going, right? And a lot of times it's a very common workflow for people to just duplicate the stuff that they're, make copies of stuff and leave the #1, and then to go through at the end when they've figured out what it is that they want to really do, and to clean up the data set names so that they are more meaningful to them. So in this case, I'm going to play with the computer alphabetical order a little bit. And I'm going to number the data sets so that they just show up in order of when we did things. Press duplicate. And so if I go to the data sets menu, I can see class examples and my new data set 0 baseline is there, and I'm viewing it. If I hit the back button, right, I'll go back to the quick start guide example baseline, and it's exactly the same, right? All the way down to the fact that I wrote add more notes in the embedded notes. One thing to also remember is that when I've pressed duplicate, I'm only duplicating the visible thing. Because the rest of the simulation is linked, right? Rather than sort of part of this, it's just a connection to it. The connection was duplicated rather than the data underneath it. And so if I follow a link and then change it, anything that is linked to that data will also change. And this is a theme that we will return to a few times today because it's, I think, one of the most important to making sure that you can compare sort of two cases, right? Is if you want to sort of compare a baseline case to a case with the controls active, you need to be able to create two completely separate simulations. And so duplicating and linking things correctly will be important. And the last button is, of course, delete. And that will move the data set to the Windows recycling bin. Right, so if I press delete here, it will say, are you sure you want to move this to the recycle bin? And if I say yes, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to make sure my recycling bin is empty first. So who knows what I've got in there. Cancel, do that. Empty recycle bin. Oh, you're not emptying because you're really full. That's why. Yeah. That's what I thought. I have a very full recycling bin. It probably has a whole database in it somewhere. But I'll let that go in the background. So when you delete the data set, it will move it to the recycling bin. And so if you find that you've deleted it by accident, you can restore it. You know, if you go to the recycling bin and then you send it back to the database or move it back to the database, CarSim will be able to re-access it. If you do that, yes, I am sure, you'll want to go to the Tools menu and use reindex probably the entire database. It only takes a moment, and what that does is it will re-examine all of the individual parse files stored on the disk and reconstruct basically the index that runs all of these dataset menus so that you can see your file back again. And I have very definitely deleted stuff by accident and then restored it. I had actually one case where I had done a bunch of work and I hadn't saved it, and I used the subversion cleanup to erase all of my changes. That was very frustrating. Fortunately, my computer had just backed up, and so I was able to actually restore all of the changes from the backup and then use a reindex to get all the files back. So it was very I owed James, our IT guy, a cup of fancy coffee for that one because he really saved my bacon. So, all right. See here. So my recycling bin is empty. I'll delete this data set there. If I look in the recycling bin, we can see it here, right? And where it came from, right? There we are. And so if I was to restore it, then I could reindex the database and it would show back up again. Leave it there for now, though. All right. Back here. All right. 3 more buttons left on the button bar, which get a bit of a brief discussion. So there's one, the library tool. It's got the little wrench. That gives you a window here that looks like this that you can use to take some sort of bulk actions on groups of data sets. So if I want to, for example, it's what I use when we're sorting this stuff out. If I wanted to take both of these data sets and give them a new category, or I could rewrite them or make an entirely new database from them. I can export them, and this is something we'll talk about later, but it's a way to share things with other users. I can bulk delete or lock or unlock, and so I can go sort of by library. And so this one here, I'm looking at the run control library, but I could also be looking at, say, something actually good. Brakes, 4-wheel system. So I could be looking at the data sets in the brakes library, and I could be using these data sets as well. All right. There's also this parse file button. So that's this one here, the parse file button, this guy right there. That opens the parse file for the current data set in a text editor. And we ship a sort of freeware program. I don't even know that it's sort of updated anymore, called Context. Here, if you have a different text editor that you prefer, I'm not going to step in. I don't have a horse in that race. I have colleagues who prefer VI, some who prefer Emacs, some who prefer Notepad++. You can use the text editor of your choice, and you can see the parse file. And so you can see there's a lot of stuff that goes kind of behind the scenes. We're setting here's some keywords, right? For example, here's an iObject0 keyword. Here's what a blue link looks like behind the screen, right? It's got a statement. Here's a new parse file, and here's its path inside the database. And then right below that, there's the information associated with the blue link, right? And we've got the embedded notes. So those are part of the parse file right here. See, here's the thing I added. Add more notes. And we've got a log entry. So when this data set is read, it'll write an entry in the log. And then it's got just some metadata down at the bottom that talks about where it's found, what the file ID is, what product it came from. And that's really useful to know, right? Because if you have a CarSim 2020.0 database, if you try and open it in a newer version, so let's say when CarSim 2021 comes out, if you open it in CarSim 2021, you would update the database and it would make some changes. It would add keywords that we had added for the release. So it upgrades the whole thing to the new version. You can't go back, right? So I can't take this CarSim 2020 data and use it in CarSim 2019. The changes it's like we're backwards compatible, but not forwards compatible, because we couldn't sort of predict what we were going to invent in the future. And that is a question that we get occasionally, which is, I upgraded my database and didn't save a copy, but now I want to go back to the old one. And it is unfortunate that the only real way to do that is to recreate the data sets by hand. So I fully recommend keeping a backup of your database. And in fact, the database upgrade process itself will give you a dialog that says, we recommend saving a copy, and we can do that for you automatically. And so if you say yes to that, it will duplicate your database and save a copy of it for you as part of the upgrade process. All right. Let's close this. All right. And then last, but certainly not least, and as sort of a something we'll hit on a lot, is the presence of this help button in the upper right-hand corner. This accesses the PDF documentation associated with this library. So if I click that, it will bring up a PDF document about the run control screen. It's got a graphic that looks familiar here. And it has information about what it displays on the screen. It'll also have a lot of these screenshots covered in little numbered circles. And that is so that you can then see, right, okay, number 1 is the vehicle or system link, and so that corresponds to this field here. So it really links, here's what all of the different fields do. And the button is context sensitive, so whatever library you're in, it will open the appropriate documentation. And the documentation, the PDF documentation is also indexed, so if you're looking at it in Adobe Reader, you can see that it builds some hierarchy into it with the bookmarks so that you can jump to sections of interest. So close that. All right, so that is that's like the high level basics of moving around in the browser. I'm going to minimize that for a bit and go back to the UI. So I said before that the browser operates a lot like a web browser, kind of stacked on a relational database. The thing with data sets is that they all have this kind of many-to-many relationship. So I can have a single run control screen linked to a vehicle, or I can have multiple run control screens linked to the same vehicle. Or I can have a vehicle, for example, that is linked to many run control screens that links to a tire. And that tire could also be used by multiple vehicles. And because the relationship works that way, when working through and configuring a new simulation, the process is to kind of go through, and you want to kind of duplicate your way from the top down and kind of split the tree apart until you've got sort of 2 separate columns. And here's what I mean by that. So on this screen, we learned about the duplicate button, and that actually exists on every screen. So I could duplicate the vehicle, and I could duplicate the tire information, and then I could change it somehow, and then I could go all the way back up and I could run the new simulation, and that would give me results that I could compare. Because this operation happens so frequently, and it's a multi-step thing, right? I would have to say, okay, if I want to create a duplicate of my C-Class hatchback, I'd have to navigate here, duplicate the hatchback, go back, and then link the duplicate to this screen. That sort of multi-step workflow happens often enough that there's a shortcut for it. If on, for example, the library selector for the C-Class hatchback, the blue link, the library selector is set to the vehicle's assembly library. If I click next to the arrow next to the blue part, that shows me the list of available data sets to select from. So I could pick a new one, but if I want to start out and just have a complete copy of the existing one, I can use copy and link dataset. And if I select that, it brings up a window very similar to the duplicate window, except it says copy and link dataset in the header and on the button. And so I can give it a new category. I can give it a new dataset name. And in this case, I'm going to just leave it the same. I'm going to leave it by default. So you can see here it's going to append the #1 onto the end. And if I press copy and link, you get a bit of blinking as it goes through it. If I expand now the datasets list here on the blue link, and I go to the C class category, you can see that I've got the 2 different datasets to choose from. If I follow the link, I'm here in my duplicate dataset. How is this different than if I did the process by hand? I'll show you. Oh, I think there's a wrong button. Chat comment. Gotcha. Yeah, so I had a question from Lal, and it was, is there a way to maximize the CarSim browser to match the screen size? Yes. So I have mine set to medium right now. So if you go to the View menu, there's actually a couple of choices here. Normally, when I'm working on an external monitor, I probably use window size matches the system display setting. And that means that however the Windows UI scaling is set, the CarSim window will be drawn appropriately. The one that is grayed out is the one that matches that top option. So small and window size matches the system display setting would be the same. I have mine set to medium right now. And that is so that it is a little bit bigger and easier to read, but I could also say maximum here. And so now it fits the width of it. I think yeah. Right, so that, hey, there we go, it's bigger. And that will be sized appropriately for the window, including the sidebar. So,
Drew, I'm using a external display to view this CarSim, but it's still not big enough for the screen.
You know what can happen a lot, and I ran into this when I came home because I don't have, I have 4K displays at my desk, and I have an old like 1084 by 768 display at home that I scrounged out of the basement. So the language that the UI is written in is a bit of an older language, and it didn't really have a concept of UI scaling. And so if you have it set so that you've got multiple displays, and so my laptop display has one scaling and my external monitor has a different scaling, that confuses the bananas out of the browser, unfortunately. It's one of the many things that we're trying to remedy, but are finding some restrictions in the programming language. And so we're working on sort of a new language, rewriting the browser, but that's a big task that doesn't really show up for you guys. What you end up having to do is to try and find a balance on the 2 monitors with some common UI scaling so that they are approximately the same. And I ended up finding that, okay, if I make it fit real well on the 1084 monitor, then my laptop monitor was like really out of whack. And similarly, right, if I set it correctly for the other one, I couldn't see it all on the other display. So I kind of sized it in the middle a little bit, and that made it work. It's one of the frustrations about the browser. that people have had, and it only really started popping up with Windows 10 and the way Windows 10 handles UI scaling. So since we've started dealing with that, that sort of started prompting the discussion of how do we fix this, and CVI didn't really have a good UI scaling solution that they have figured out yet. So the matching it is going to unfortunately mean probably tweaking your display settings, or I came to the conclusion that, like for the training today, I'm running on just my laptop screen, whereas I will connect the external monitor if I'm trying to, say, have a CarSim window open on one side and Word document in the other because I'm writing documentation. Then it's worth monkeying with it and hooking up the external monitor. But otherwise, I try and just use my laptop screen.
Okay.
Yeah, at the office where my laptop display and my monitors are all the same resolution, it's much better. It's not nearly so much of an issue.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So one more question.
Mm-hmm.
What is the language used to develop this CarSim?
So the solver is written in C,
Okay.
partially by hand and partially via machine-generated code.
Okay.
And the browser is written in CVI currently, although that's going to change. And I don't actually know what language the visualizer is written in. I'd have to ask Porter. He's the visualizer developer, or the main developer for the visualizer. But the main underpinnings of the solver, which are really the important part, is C.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. But it ships in compiled form, right? We don't ever ship uncompiled solver code, because that's the valuable part, right? So, but we've done so. There is an API, both for the solver itself and for the browser. You can actually take action in the browser using the Windows COM interface, which was fine for many years, and then we started running on Linux, and so now we're looking for other solutions there as well. But then the solver also has an API, so you can access it. You can write C code to call the browser function, or call the solver functions, right? And that's all actually covered in the documentation. So if you go to help and to reference manuals, there is a couple of things, right? There is the VS API, which talks about the solver API. There's the VS COM interface, which is the browser API. We have something called VS Connect, which is a new tool, which lets you kind of do things like run Unreal Engine as your visualization tool, and maybe as the provider of the road surface, and the CarSim solver for vehicle physics, and a tightly coupled Simulink controls model, all together, right? And the big issue there is that you end up running the Unreal Engine and the CarSim solver asynchronously, because Unreal updates at the frame rate, and you want to update the CarSim solver much more frequently than that, so that you can get good information, and you don't get your time steps aren't too huge, for example. So that's used a lot in things like driving simulators and things like that. But people are also exploring it for other tools, and especially in ADAS and autonomous development tool chains. Okay. So it's a bit of an aside, but and I did see that you asked about a go-kart like vehicle, and the answer to start there is actually no. Go-karts do not have a suspension typically. And one of the underlying assumptions in CarSim is that you have sort of a sprung mass and an unsprung mass, or an unsprung masses, right? So that the sprung mass is suspended by springs, and there is some compliance between the where the wheels are mounted and the chassis of the vehicle. Now, that said, we also have a simulation of a tractor, which similarly has very often no a hard-mounted rear axle. And so we sort of show with that model how you can mimic the response of that kind of a suspension with the current solver. One of the things that we'll do, though, is one of the few things that I mentioned earlier, which will necessitate probably shrinking the time step, because you'll start to make the model very stiff, and the derivatives will be very steep, and that tends to make the model numerically unstable, which means you need to shrink the time step, often by a lot, which means that you'll start to run into can't run this in real time type situations. Okay, so back to where I was, just to
one more thing.
Yep.
I've seen a couple of videos on the go-kart simulation in the CarSim. Is there a way to import, create a new one or something like that of a go-kart?
You totally could. You'd have to know what the data was, and like I said, I would assume if they're doing a go-kart, which video are you referring to specifically? I don't know if I've seen that one. Is it one that we put out a long time ago, or is it?
I think so. I've seen it in the YouTube.
Oh.
I've seen a go-kart going.
Okay. Yeah, they're probably abusing the solver a little bit, would be my guess, and doing it similar to the tractor model, which we could talk about it offline. But the way to model that, right, would be to you still have springs and things, but you'd have very, very, very stiff springs between the front, the sprung and the unsprung masses. And then you just have to watch your time step to make sure it didn't get numerically unstable. But it definitely has effects on the simulation and how it runs when you start making things really stiff like that.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right, so I want to just kind of rewind a little bit so that I get back on track. So I created this link here using copy and link, right? And so that was a one-step process. And I thought that I would illustrate just a little bit what it looks like if we used the other method, which would be, okay, so I want to create a copy of this. I navigate in. I press duplicate. So C-class. Notice that it said #2 there automatically. So press duplicate. Now I have to go back, and you can see here the first back took me back to the original C-class hatchback. The second back returns me to the run control screen, and you can see that it's still linked to the original. And so then I'd have to go and link. So comparatively, right, it saves you a bunch of steps if you use copy and link, but you end up in the same place, which is you've got an exact duplicate of the link target. I call it the child data set, and the parent data set is linked there. So you makes a duplicate of the child and then relinks it to the parent. Let's see here. And then if we wanted, you could then change the data on the vehicle level here, and it would make a different simulation since we have a duplicate of the data set. And in fact, that's what we're going to explore in the first of the basic examples. But before I do that, I want to talk about databases and things. So the idea of creating a new database came up earlier, and it's definitely possible to do it. There's actually a couple of different ways you can go about it. If you want to just say wholesale create a copy of an existing database, you can actually use the Windows File Explorer and just copy and paste your database folder and then rename it something. And it will then represent an exact duplicate of the CarSim database that you copy pasted. And that's how I made, for example, well, it's in my public documents here. That's how I made this CarSim data folder here, is I copied my installation database and I pasted it here in this folder, and then I renamed it CarSim data so that it would match what you guys would see, except for I have this extra folder in there. But from within the software, there's also a couple of different ways that you can go about it. So if I'm here at the Run Control screen, I can actually go up to the File menu, and I can select New Database from this data set, and that will make a complete copy of everything needed to run this simulation. So from this parent all the way down through all the children and grandchildren, everything needed to run this simulation will get kind of packed up and put into a new database where we pick. And so I can do that as an example, right? So I'll go new database from this data set, right? And it will say, give you a confirmation dialog, and I'll say, it may take a few minutes. It's usually pretty quick on a modern computer, but it depends on how many things you have linked to it. So I'll click continue. It gives you the option to include your preferences parse file and any run output. In this case, I'm going to include the preferences parse file, but not the run output. I'm going to click OK. And then you have the option how you want to view the new database. You can open it in a new window. You can just switch the current browser session over to that new database. I think in this case, I'm going to open it in an additional window, just so that I don't close the original, because we'll go back there. And it lets you browse for a folder where you want to create the new database. And this is going to need to be an empty folder that you can use, that it will turn into the database. And so I'm going to select public. I'm going to select 2020, right? And below that, I've got just my CarSim data folder here. So I'm going to make a new folder. And I'm going to call this train database. And so I've got an empty folder now called training database, and I'm going to click OK. I've got my new folder selected, and I'll click OK. And what this really actually does is it uses a couple of existing operations all sort of combined together. That's fine. Reindex and rewrite the entire database. And it makes sure when you import the data, it makes sure that the data is current for the version of CarSim that you're using. It makes sure that it is all good data, that you're not using any deprecated libraries. It will let you know if the data you're bringing in is going to connect to a library that's going away, and things like that, which is why you got a couple of dialogues here. So it says every data set in your database has been rewritten, and that just makes sure that the parse files align with the library information from the browser. It took 8 seconds. The only time doing that operation takes longer is when you do the entire database, because there's some very big data sets in there for detailed kind of road situations, and those can take a while to regenerate. So I'll hit OK. And so now I'm going to change my view size here back to medium. And I'm going to turn off the sidebar. This is one of those cases. So we can show it side by side here. I've got, sort of side by side anyways. I've got the two databases now, and you can see right in this window that's in the back, up in the title bar, it says CarSim data for the database. And in the window that's in the foreground, it says training database. If I look at the datasets menu on the original database, there's many, many, many datasets in the run control library. And if I look here in the training database, I have just the quick start example baseline that I exported. Further, right one, it's locked because it's a brand new database. And if I unlock it and I look for the vehicles, I only have C-Class hatchback #2, right? Because that is the one that was linked actively when I created this new database. So if you have an example that you want to split off and use it as the source for developing a new simulation, this is one way you can go about it, especially if you want to keep it sort of isolated. I use it from time to time when I'm working on stuff for training examples and things, is I'll say, okay, I assembled the bits that I wanted, but I want to shift it over to a clean database so that I can make sure that, just by using my other database, I don't change a data set and have my training stuff not work properly anymore. If in this example though, and this will be something you may encounter, especially because you're working kind of as a bigger team, is, okay, I made a really nice simulation and I want to share data with a coworker, right? What's the best way to share data with a coworker? And my answer to that is always, it depends a little bit. First, it depends on, do you have your database in version control? If the answer is yes, then that's a good way to share. But if the answer is no, it's just two users using CarSim and you want to pass data back and forth, then there's something called a consolidated parse file, which really takes all of the simulation data from whatever data set you're viewing, whether that's a run control or a vehicle or a procedure. It doesn't need to be the whole simulation. It can be a part of it. It takes from that data set and its children, and it packs them up into a single file, which it's easy to then pass via email or file sharing or something, and makes it so that you can then share. And I'm going to use actually these two databases that I have here open right now as an example of that, and I'm just going to pass a vehicle, right? So we saw in my training database that I only have this C-Class hatchback #2. That's the only one I've got. And I'm going to go click the link on C-Class hatchback #2 here. So I'm looking at the vehicles library. I'm going to pull up the datasets menu, and I'm going to switch to an exotic sports car. This exotic car, mid-engine, manual transmission, that's a nice one, right? It's a very different looking vehicle. It's got very different kind of data describing it. And I want to pass this over to, well, myself over this other database, but it could also be to a coworker. If I go to the File menu, I can go down to Export Consolidated Parse File. You'll see there also that you're able to export an expanded parse file, but that it's labeled as legacy, that you can export an encrypted expanded parse file, and that you can export expanded notes. Expanded notes is really just a text file that concatenates all of the embedded notes from the parent and all of its children into a single text file. The expanded parse file, the legacy option, has a lot of the same content as the consolidated parse file. The main difference is that if you have an attached, if you have other information, maybe it is custom animator assets so that you've got a custom shape for your vehicle. Maybe it is external data in some sort of an external table, engine map or something like that you want to come along. Additional MATLAB M files or Python files that are associated with the model and key to its operation. The expanded parse file will not bring those along. The consolidated parse file will bring along any file that's directly referenced in the parse files. And there's actually a command that you can include in a yellow field, like this one down here, that could bring along any other files that you may need from the database. And so it's a really useful way for packing up things and making sure that you have all of the things together in one package. And so I'm going to say export consolidated parse file. So it's this top option here. And it will say, where are you going to save it? And in this case, I'm going to take a route where I can find it again, and I'm going to click it on to I'm going to put it on the desktop. If the default, so the first time you do this, the default is going to be the root of the currently active database folder. After you've saved something somewhere else once, it will remember that, and so it will default to the last place you saved files. And so if you have a folder for exported CPAR files, then that will be the place that it defaults. So I'm going to just put it on the desktop, and I'm going to say files for coworker.cpar. And it has the extension .cpar for consolidated parse file. And I'm going to press save. You can see that it's exporting it, creating the CPAR. And it will give you some information. Say here, I wrote it, here's where I put it. I put it on C users, me, desktop, files for coworker CPAR, and 19 support file links handled, which is how many files are linked here. So how many children there are. Click OK. And now I'm going to minimize this one and pretend to be, turn the sidebar back on, pretend to be training database me. So now I'm going to go from being the sending person, sending coworker, to the receiving coworker. And if I want to bring that file, it's right there on my desktop, into CarSim from any library, I can go up to the File menu, and I can go down and I can select Import Parse File, any export type. And if I click that, it will, so I've imported something before, so it's taking me to the desktop. Files for coworker.cpar, so there we are. That is the vehicle that I exported before. And I'm just going to click open. When I do that, it's going to give me some choices now. One is to have the data in the local database, the receiving database, basically be the master data. And so data coming in, if it has the same UUID, will just not get imported. And that's the default setting. You can also say, no, right, I'm re-importing the same CPAR again because I messed up the data and I want to restore it, so that you could check the radio button down to overwrite existing local data. And in that case, data with the same UUID will get replaced by the data from the CPAR file. I'm going to leave that at do not overwrite. There's some other things that you can do. You can change the category. So if I click this box and put a category in here, and it sort of presupposes that you're not going to type in a category name that already exists in that other database. Otherwise, it could have some trouble merging the files, but I could type whatever I want in here. So imported files, and every data set that gets imported will be given the category imported files, for example. I think actually I will do that in this case, just so we can see what it does. It tells us we've got a choice here, match by UUID. Files that have the same UUID will be flagged in the preview, and you'll have a choice, do I skip importing this, or do I want to continue importing it? Do I want to continue importing it but give it a new name or a new UUID? Kind of how do you want to handle it? You can preview the results so you can see what's going to happen when you merge this in ahead of time. And here you can check, right, that will filter that list of preview results down to just things that are conflicted. So rather than looking at everything, you can see just the conflicts. I'm going to leave this looking this way here. So we'll preview the results, but we'll see all of them. And we're going to put everything in a new category, imported files. So I'll click OK. And that brings up this preview window. I'm going to expand this a little bit. Oh, you're not going to expand, are you? Yeah, you are. Okay, there we go. All right. If I want to see some more detailed information, I can view a more detailed import log, but this screen really tells me everything I need to know here. So you'll see by default, it's flagged things that have a conflict, and it tells you if it's the UUID or if it's the file name. And it defaults to skipping that file, but you can import it anyways, or you can clone it, and that will give it a new UUID. We'll just let it skip by now. Things that get reused or don't have a conflict are set to import by UUID. You can see the category will all be imported files, and then there'll be which library it's going to go into, and what the title of the data set is, and then the UUID is listed over here on the right. So if I hit OK now, this information will import according to basically the action in this column. So the first couple will be skipped, and then it will import an aerodynamics file into the basic aerodynamics library, and then it'll skip a bunch more, and then it'll bring in a brake caliper, animator reference frame, etc. So hit OK. Takes a moment to import the parse file. Tell you it brought in 67 files. It skipped 22. It took 2.4 seconds. There we go. Click OK. It's going to check now to make sure that none of the imported data references a file that's missing. And so now, if I click on my drop-down arrow for the vehicle, I have C class, so that's the hatchback number 2. I currently have selected. There's a little check mark. Or I have imported files, which is what I gave the new category, and the exotic car mid-engine manual transmission right here. So I can switch that. And so I could run the same example now with a exotic sports car instead of with the C-Class hatchback in my separate database. So it's sort of like both sides there of importing that. Okay. And it looks like I missed my timer for taking a break. I'm going to actually I'd like to keep going if that would be okay with everybody, because I've got a couple of examples that I want to go through now, because that's where we're at. Unless, actually, well, yeah, we could stop for 5 minutes right now, just to let people stretch and things again. It's been a long time staring at the computer, and I realize that I need to get a drink of water or I will not have a voice tomorrow. So I'm going to pause things here and